Over the years, several Zelda games have gotten remakes. Starting with Link's Awakening DX in 1998, but really kicking off with the 3D games in the 2010s, many classic adventures have been touched up with better graphics and gameplay enhancements. Well, usually enhancements. With Skyward Sword getting the remake treatment last year, the pool of games eligible for a re-release is starting to dry up. But are there any more games that warrant a remake? That's what this video is here to analyze. I've picked 4, or technically 5, games that I think deserve a second wind, and will explain my reasons why. I will also cover the reasons against remaking them, or why it might be unlikely to happen. I've also ranked them based on how needed and how likely they are to happen, and I'll be working from the lowest on up. With that out of the way, here are my ideas for future Zelda remakes. At number 4 we have Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. This game is my personal least favorite in the series, and many people don't look back on it fondly. However, that's exactly why I think it could benefit from a remake. A lot of the game's issues were the product of hardware limitations or outdated design choices, but a modern update could patch it right up. The biggest entry barrier would be the punishing difficulty, but this could be solved in many ways. Nintendo could add difficulty modes that affect enemy damage and the number of lives you start with easier settings letting people ease into the game, and harder settings pleasing the hardcore players who want the original experience. They could also make it so that you respawn at whatever area you're already in when you lose all your lives, instead of the beginning of the map. This, as well as updating the dialogue and making it clearer where to find secrets, would allow the game's unique and fun aspects to shine. Of course, this isn't too likely to happen. Adventure of Link is already available on Nintendo Switch Online, and there's even a bonus version that makes the game easier. Putting a remake on Switch would mean that it would compete for sales with the online service. There's also the fact that Adventure of Link is a black sheep of the series, and newcomers would feel alienated. With how many fans Breath of the Wild created, Nintendo wouldn't want to steer them away with such an odd take on the series. This unfortunately makes a remake unlikely in the foreseeable future, but I'd give it a chance if it ever came out. Just imagine a fully reorchestrated palace theme. At number 3 is The Legend of Zelda, the one that started it all. The game is still hailed as a beloved classic, but there's no denying that it's shown signs of age. Poorly translated clues, clunky movement, and bare-bones visuals hold it back by modern standards. A remake could give it brand new but still classic-inspired visuals, make the clues coherent, and polish Link's movement to bring the game to life in a new era. On top of that, it follows the same wide-open approach as Breath of the Wild, which would please new fans while also exposing them to the style of 2D Zelda, much like Link's Awakening did. The game is such a blank slate in some ways that I could see them adding tons of new content. For example, they could embellish the story with an opening cinematic and some occasional cutscenes, or add new NPCs and minigames. Depending on how far they were willing to stray, I could even see them revising the dungeons to make them a bit more distinct and interesting, and not just visually. Of course, there would be downsides to remaking The Legend of Zelda. And just like its sequel, it's available on Nintendo Switch Online, which would create the same problems. The other main issue is that even with tweaks, it might come across as too vanilla by today's standards. Link's first outing is a masterpiece of its time, but stripped of its original context, it wouldn't pass as a modern game. Because of that, I could see it getting a Link Between Worlds style sequel, rather than a true remake. Something in the same style, but with enough changes to make it interesting for new audiences. If Nintendo ever makes a new 2D Zelda, I think that would be a good idea. My runner-up for the most deserving and most likely Zelda remake is Minishcap. The game holds up pretty well, so it doesn't strictly need one, but I would still welcome it. It didn't do great on its first run on the Game Boy Advance, barely pulling 1 million copies, but today it's remembered fondly by hardcore Zelda fans. Building on its already solid foundation with 3D models, visuals inspired by Wind Waker HD, and an orchestrated soundtrack would make it even more of a gem than it already is. That's really all that would need to be done, which would leave developers plenty of time to throw in some new content. If Nintendo wants to remake another classic Zelda, I really see no downsides to choosing Minishcap. The only potential problem is that it was developed by Capcom. I don't know exactly how the copyright works, but I'd imagine they'd at least have to ask for permission before re-releasing the game, and also relinquish some of the profit. While that might discourage Nintendo, I think it would be worth the effort. Coming out on top as the likeliest remake is a 2-in-1 game, Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages. Like Minishcap, these Capcom-developed games are well liked in the hardcore Zelda community, but generally overlooked, despite the fact that they sold decently. They still hold up well gameplay-wise, but the Game Boy Color visuals and sound quality leave a lot to be desired. These factors make the Oracles a natural choice for the remake treatment. Another point in their favor is the fact that the original versions used many of the same assets as Link's Awakening. Since that game already got a Switch remake, and the Oracles have more or less been canonized as sequels in the latest official timeline, Nintendo could easily reuse their engine for Link's Awakening Switch to crank out Oracle remakes. They could even address some of the plot holes their timeline placement created, such as tweaking Zelda's dialogue so that she's already met Link. Everything seems to be lined up perfectly for these games. However, there would be some challenges to consider. The art style of Link's Awakening Switch was controversial, and was one of the main reasons why I personally chose to skip the remake. It was based on the idea of the game taking place in a dream world, justifying its quirky style and tone. Seasons and Ages, while technically sequels, take place in the actual world of Hyrule, so it would make more sense to use a style like A Link to the Past, which also technically features the same Link. Them looking like Link's Awakening was justified back in the day because the Game Boy Color didn't really allow for much visual variation, but copying the style of the remake would be lazy. There's also the challenge of this being 2 games instead of 1. Even if Nintendo was generous enough to sell it as one packaged deal, this would still be a lot of extra work for the developers. On top of that, getting the games to link up might not work as well on Switch. I'm not a programmer by any means, but the way it worked on Game Boy might not translate to the new hardware. They might have to completely redo the passcode system, which would be another thing they might not want to deal with. If that weren't enough, the games were made by Capcom, which would create the same potential issues as a Minishcap remake. At the end of the day though, I still think the Oracles would be the best choice for the next Zelda remake. Those are my picks for the next Zelda remake. With all of the 3D games except Breath of the Wild having remakes now, it seems the only option for new ones are the 2D games. Which one do you think will be next, if any? Is 2D Zelda a thing of the past? Sound off in the comments. This is FP Productions, and I'll see you next time.